Hello everyone, and welcome to another discography review. And today I've got for you the one, the only, Metallica. I was going to review Megadeth's discography next, however, let's be honest, Megadeth always has to come in second place to Metallica. I don't make the rules, I just follow them. Now if you're even remotely familiar with heavy metal music, you know who Metallica is. Even people that aren't familiar know who Metallica is. They don't need an introduction. So for the purposes of this review, we will be talking about every studio album the band has released up until this point. I might mention an EP or a few other extra projects, but we're not going to talk about compilations, live albums, anything like that. Pretty much just sticking to the studio albums. Besides maybe a casual reference. That means I'm also not really going to talk too much about turmoil or other events surrounding this band outside of the music, beyond a cursory mention every now and again. Also, to explain my rating system, I rate the albums A through F, A being the best, F being the worst. So it's similar to our school grading system here in the US, except I added an E. And then of course there can be pluses or minuses if I deem an album worthy of such. A being obviously the best and close to perfect album status. A B status is an album that's really, really good. A C status is an album that's either on the good side of okay to a pretty good album, but not great. D would be an album on the bad side of okay, bordering on bad. E would be an actual bad album, and F is obviously the worst. So let's get started with the first album, Kill 'Em All, released in 1983. This is kind of an interesting album for me. It's definitely very raw, it feels a little bit more unfocused. And of the albums that were available at the time when I was in high school, this is the album that took me the longest to get into. And I'm going to be honest, 30 years later, there are still several tracks that just don't do it for me. The good news is there are several really good tracks on here as well. The standouts being The Four Horsemen and Seek and Destroy. Those were the two songs I wanted to hear when I bought the album, and those remain my two favorites even to this day. It just feels like there's more to these songs compared to the others. I especially like the galloping rhythm of Four Horsemen, which is better than Mechanics, by the way. And I always forget about the melodic section in that track. There's a slower, proggy section with a melodic guitar solo in the middle of the song, and I'm not sure why, but I always forget about that. But the galloping rhythm that goes throughout most of the song kind of reminds me of something Iron Maiden would do. It definitely feels influenced by them. However, it doesn't sound like Iron Maiden, which is nice. They're definitely doing their own thing here. And this is the one actual song Dave Mustaine can claim to have written a healthy portion of. It's just Metallica took his ideas and made it better. And of course, Seek and Destroy is a staple. I love the guitar riffs in that track. And it's a good example of a simple chorus that works. But outside of those two songs, there are still several standouts. Listening back to this album, I forgot how good Hit the Lights is. And I really like Whiplash and Phantom Lord. Even back in the day, those were the two tracks that stood out to me outside of the two I already knew. But the rest of the album just doesn't really cut it for me. It's not bad, but there's just something missing. You've got an instrumental, you've got Jump on the Fire, you've got Motor Breath, Metal Militia, No Remorse. I always forget No Remorse for some reason. They're not terrible tracks, but they just don't do anything for me either. They never have, and I think at this point it's safe to say they never will. So rating this album is tough because when it hits, and I like half the album quite a bit. But the other half is just kind of meh, but it's also not terrible. At this album's worst, it's still okay. I'm going to give this album a C+. I really thought about a B-, but there is enough filler, I just can't justify that ranking. And now we get into the real shit. 1984's Ride the Lightning. Wow, what an album. I'm going to spoil things by saying that when ranking Metallica's discography, This album is number 1A. This is my favorite album, barely, because the next one is really, really close. But I love this album. Even as a kid, I loved this album when I first heard it. Every song is catchy, every song sounds different. The production is great. The musicianship is solid. The vocals are good. Everything just clicks on this album. Even on Escape, which I know a lot of people don't like. The album opens with Fight Fire with Fire, and I love the acoustic intro to this track. And then it turns into the fastest, heaviest song this band has ever done. I love that track. The riffs, the pounding drums, the vocals work nicely. Like I said, it is their heaviest song as far as I know. And it transitions really well into the title track, which is still up-tempo, but slow by comparison. There's a really nice guitar riff going throughout this track. I really like the catchy chorus. The solo's good. Overall, just a fantastic follow-up to the opening track. And then we get a more melodic track with For Whom the Bell Tolls. It's not soft, but it's not as heavy as the two previous tracks. And I love the use of the bells in this track. And it's probably rare to compliment Lars, but I love the pounding drums in this track. It's pretty simple but effective. And I love how the guitar chords ring out throughout parts of this track. And again, we get kind of a simple chorus here, but it works really well. Overall, I love the atmosphere to this track, and I love that guitar lick that plays in between the chorus and the next verse. And then we get Metallica's first ballad with Fade to Black. I probably would not have minded a chorus, but this kind of feels a bit Sabbath-like in structure in that they let the music act as the chorus, and that works too. I really like the sound of the acoustic guitars in this track. It is a depressing song given its subject matter, which I'm not getting into for fear of the video being taken down because of YouTube. But it is a solid track, and I really like the solo. Trapped Under Ice brings back the thrash. This is the most Kill 'Em All this album gets with the song, and it's a really nice catchy thrasher. And had it been on Kill 'Em All, it would have been a standout, along with the other songs I mentioned liking. But I'm glad it's on here because this is a perfect album, so hey. And then we get Escape, which feels more traditional metal, maybe even pop metal to a degree, as it is a pretty catchy song, but catchy doesn't mean pop necessarily. I think I've heard that even the band doesn't like this track, which is a shame because I think it's quite good. Is it the best song on the album? No, of course not, but I think it's a really nice track and offers something different. And then we get Creeping Death. Wow, what a fucking song. It's heavy, it's thrashy, it's got some melodic parts to it. The chorus is super catchy. I really like the sinister opening riff to this song. I really like the main riff in this song. Overall, it's just a great track and a great way to almost end the album because it ends on an instrumental, which I'm not typically a fan of instrumentals. It's just, they're not my thing. But I will admit Call of Cthulhu for an instrumental is pretty dang solid. Overall, this is a perfect album. One of the few albums I've ever heard that I would use that title for. This album gets an A++. This thing is fantastic and definitely worth your time. And not only is it my favorite Metallica album, it is among my favorite albums of all time. Next, we have 1986's Master of Puppets, and this album gives Ride the Lightning a run for its money. This is 1B on my Metallica rankings. I can't lower it enough to call it a 2 or say that it's second place. It's got to be 1B. This thing is phenomenal. I will admit this album took me a lot longer to get into than Ride the Lightning. I got this album when I was 15 or 16, and it never really grew on me for a long time. I was 24 or 25 when it finally clicked with me, and it's been among my favorite albums ever since. If I have to say some negatives about this thing, it's not as catchy, not as accessible as Ride the Lightning, and the songs can feel like they're a bit much when you're trying to get into it. This is probably not a starter album. I would recommend Ride the Lightning for that. The album is definitely a lot more progressive. The shortest song is a little over 5 minutes long, so you're not getting any short and punchy tracks here. The album opens with Battery, which is a phenomenal opening track. It follows a similar format to Fight Fire with Fire. You've got an acoustic intro leading to a heavy thrasher, but it's done differently. Whereas the intro to Fight Fire with Fire was more beautiful and melodic, the acoustic intro to this track is more sinister. And while you could say both songs kind of have a sinister vibe, it feels like there's a little more to this track in terms of that vibe. I really like the chorus to this one again, and I say this a lot, but the guitar riffs are really nice. And again, I like the drum beat during the chorus to this track. It's probably my second favorite opening track they ever did to Fight Fire with Fire. Next, we have the title track, Master of Puppets, and this song is a classic for a reason. I love the guitar riffs in this track. I keep saying that a lot, but trust me, that will not be the case throughout this entire discography. I love how all four members play off of each other in that intro, drums, bass, and both guitars. And I really like James's vocals, especially during the verses. They have a really nice sound to them. Probably a production thing. And that chorus is pretty fucking catchy. And the solo is really nice, and I especially like the quieter part of this track, when it kind of slows down a bit and we get a melodic bit. I like the guitar tone for both the rhythm and lead during this part, and I love how it builds back into the heavier, faster solo. It's really nice. This is a borderline perfect song. And then we move on to something a bit slower and more melodic with The Thing That Should Not Be. Now, it's still fairly heavy. It's not a ballad by any means, but there are some little bits of acoustic guitar thrown into this track. It's a lot more slow. I want to say groovy to a point. I'm not sure if that's accurate. I don't know if you could say this song really has a chorus. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I'm not really sure. There are certain bits that repeat themselves, but it's certainly not a catchy one. It's still a really cool track. I like the vibe to this one. And there are, again, several really nice guitar riffs throughout this one. And then we get the ballad Welcome Home Sanitarium. This one, except adding a chorus to it, kind of follows the Fade to Black formula. You got verse, chorus, which Fade to Black didn't have a chorus. And then you get like a bridge, and then it just ends on a long solo, which is pretty nice. I like this one a lot, actually. I like the vibe of this one, talking about an insane asylum. And it has a nice solo to it as well. And then the album picks up again with Disposable Heroes. This song's a lot more up-tempo than the previous two tracks. It moves from being more of an upper mid-tempo song to being really fast and thrashy at times. And the chorus is pretty memorable. And then we go into Lapierre Messiah, which is a bit slower and more groovy for most of it. There is a faster, thrashier part later on in the song. This is one of my favorites on the album, actually. And then there's an instrumental, which I've already said I'm not really too into instrumentals, but it's okay. And then we get the thrasher Damage Incorporated to end the album. I won't say this feels like Kill 'Em All era, but it's definitely the thrashiest song on the album. And a really good one, and a nice way to close out the album. What else can I say about this album that hasn't already been said? This is a phenomenal album, and it definitely gets an A+ in my ranking. And I'm going to stop track by tracking the rest of the albums. I did that with these past two because they're so good. I felt like each track deserved a mention. I will try to mention each track, but going forward, I'm not going to stop to talk specifically about every track. I just wanted to on these past two albums. And this is where one of those life events does happen that I will mention briefly. Bassist Cliff Burton died somewhere between this album and the next. And instead of taking the time to grieve and move on whenever they were ready, they decided to get a new bass player, Jason Newsted, and move forward. And it's well documented going forward how Jason Newsted was treated in this band. And we would see this again in Avenged Sevenfold when they lost their drummer as well. It's one of those things I feel like they should have waited before making the next album. Now, granted, the next album is a good one, but it could have been better if they took a little time, even if they were writing in the meantime. So next we get to talk about 1988's and Justice for All. Again, it's well documented the problems with the production. The bass was turned all the way down. The guitars have a really nice tone to them, and I do like the sound of the drums. James's vocals are starting to sound more like what people tend to think of, except without those annoying inflections yet, so that's nice. But it does feel a little off not having that bass there. I have heard people add bass back into these tracks, and it does sound a lot better. Although sometimes I think those folks overdo it with the bass, kind of an overcompensation thing. These songs tend to be a lot more progressive. It feels like they were going for even longer songs than on the previous albums, and these songs are getting less and less accessible. This is one of those albums, whenever I just think of it, I think of it as not really bad, but kind of a slog, and one of those albums that I only really like a few songs on. Or there's at least only a few songs I really look forward to hearing. However, every time I actually take the time to listen to it, I end up really enjoying it. The opening track, Blackened, is a really solid track. Again, it starts off quiet and then moves into a faster, thrashier track. Eye of the Beholder is one of my favorite songs on the album. This song has my favorite guitar riffs on the album. The title track is really good. One was their first music video, and again, it's a ballad, but it's a pretty good one. Even being a ballad, I feel like the most iconic part of this song is the heavy bit at the end. The guitar riffs are memorable. You got that double bass drum going there. Again, still some compliments for Lars at this point, and kind of deals with some tough subject matter at a time when I'm not sure if it was relevant or not. I was too young at the time when this album came out to know, but I don't think we were in the middle of a war at that time. So the first half of this album is actually pretty solid. Shortest Straw is another really good track with a number of really good riffs. The kind of Wizard of Oz kind of thing they got going at the beginning is interesting, and the chorus is memorable. And Dyer's Eve finishes off the album on a thrashy note, but the rest of the album doesn't do it for me really. Again, kind of like with Kill 'Em All, these remaining songs are not bad, but they just don't really click with me all that much. So this is still a pretty decent album. It's just not one that I come back to as much. I'm going to give this album a solid B. It is really good, just not as good as the two perfect albums that preceded it. Next, we have the self-titled album, or the Black Album as everybody calls it, released in 1991. And this is the album that put the band on the map. Even as a kid, I had heard of these guys, although I didn't know anything by them at the time because nobody in my house listened to metal. But this is the album that almost everybody heard as their first Metallica album, unless you go back to the 80s days. Typically, this is the album everybody hears first. And the band made a change here. They decided to make more accessible songs. The song structure is a lot simpler. The music is a lot simpler. Pretty much every song has a catchy chorus. And it paid off. This album is massive. Anybody watching this already knows that. It basically made these guys millionaires. Or even billionaires at this point. Who knows? And as somebody who's more into the 80s stuff now, it was a little different back when I was in high school when I got into this band. I definitely prefer the 80s stuff. I would rather listen to all four of the previous albums over this, even though I do like this more than Kill 'Em All. Blasphemy, I know, but it is what it is. But there are definitely things that annoy me about this album. I can't stand Lars's drumming on this album. It's not only very basic, but just something about it puts me off. And I can't put my finger on it. I don't know, I'm not a drummer. Also, getting into the negatives, I never really liked God That Failed. And something about Sad But True always bothered me to the point that I actively dislike the song now. Enter Sandman is definitely cringe, and it's another one I just don't really care to listen to ever again. but I will give that song its due, as it was my gateway song that got me into music heavier than Guns N' Roses. And I also don't really care for Nothing Else Matters, although the solo is pretty decent. This album would also see Kirk break out the wah pedal, and that would become a staple for him throughout the 90s. But other than that, and this is definitely a step down in quality, I still can't hate on the album too much, because this was, for me, my first Metallica album. It was my gateway album into heavier music. And there are solid tracks on here. Through the Never, Holier Than Thou, Struggle Within are pretty heavy up-tempo songs. I would not call them thrash. They've kind of ditched all of that, but those are still solid tracks. I actually really like The Unforgiven and Wherever I May Roam. Those are the only two singles that still hold up for me. My Friend of Misery has an interesting vibe to it, and I like the quieter bit during the instrumental break. Don't Tread on Me is more of a mid-tempo song, but it's a pretty good one. A Wolf and Man is also a pretty good track that I tend to forget about. That one and Through the Never I forget about a lot, but they are pretty solid tracks. So overall, there's still a lot I like on this album. I'll also add that Holier Than Thou is my favorite song on the album and has my favorite guitar riffs. It's just, at this point in my life, I prefer the thrash style of metal, especially the way Metallica did it, because it seemed like they mixed in catchy songwriting with more progressive song structures and thrashy elements, which worked really well in the 80s, but they've ditched most of that here. But it's still a decent album. This is another tough one to score. I guess I'm going to give it a C+. I don't know, it's pretty decent, but I don't know if I can quite give it a B, considering a third of the album I actively dislike. Yeah, C+, that's what I'll go with. Next, we have Load, released in 1996. This is a weird one for me. This is the first album they put out since I had been listening to the band. And it was definitely a surprise with the first single, Until It Sleeps. I'll get into that more here in a bit. This album goes more into the hard rock, classic rock style. They're moving even more away from metal. There are little hints at metal here and there, but it's mostly gone at this point. The musicianship is not nearly as good as it was. These guys are really good at what they do, and unfortunately, as they move away from that, they just show that they're not really that versatile musicians. Gone are the really engaging guitar riffs. The guitar solos they have are a lot simpler and don't really work for me. They drown them in effects at times. Kirk loves that whammy bar thing, wah-wah pedal, whatever. And I really don't like the guitar tone on this album. It's among my least favorite guitar tones I've ever heard on an album. There are worse out there, definitely, but it's still not one I care for all that much, even to this day. And I think the songwriting has generally gotten worse as well. The standout for me is King Nothing. I think this song is actually really good, and it's the one song on here that I look forward to listening to. I think Hero of the Day is a decent ballad, but even as a teenager I laughed because whenever you get that opening guitar lick, it makes me think of Pearl Jam. And I don't think I should be thinking of Pearl Jam when I'm listening to Metallica. And I don't mind Pearl Jam either. You've got Until It Sleeps, which this was the first single. Imagine hearing that opening drum beat and bass line, and then you get James's vocals kick in. Everything seems like it's going okay, like something off the Black Album. And then that guitar lick kicks in. And at the very least, they needed a better sound for this thing. I think they probably needed a different guitar part, but they definitely needed a better sound for that. The rest of the song is okay, though. It's not that bad, and once you're used to the guitar tone, it works okay. My big issue, and I've noticed this for over 30 years now, after the softer section of the song where they have what I guess would be considered a solo, the song starts building back up towards a heavier section. Now on the song, they go into the chorus to end the song. But even as a teenager, I couldn't help but feel like we should be getting a heavier section with a guitar solo, something similar to what we might have got on the Black Album. And they don't do that here. It's just an example of how they've really toned down the musicianship. And before I talk about any other songs on here, I've got to say this album is way too long. And that will be the case for the rest of their discography. It clocks in at an agonizing 79 minutes. And that's way too long, especially for an album of this style. And trust me, you will feel that album length too. This thing can drag a lot. The two biggest culprits on here being Bleeding Me, which actually has some decent moments, and Outlaw Torn, which I do not like that song at all. That song just drags. It's at such a slow pace and really goes nowhere interesting. At least with songs like Welcome Home Sanitarium, The Unforgiven, One, those songs consistently move and do things that are interesting. This song doesn't do any of that. Bleeding Me is a bit more frustrating because there are good moments to this song. I like the slower atmospheric moments. The heavier section is actually really cool and reminds me of the Black Album. It's the one moment on this album where it really feels like older Metallica. But that song just drags on and on and on. Both of these songs being 8 to 9 minutes long, and neither of them needed to be that long. If Bleeding Me had been a 5 to 5.5 minute song, this one would have been pretty good. The House That Jack Built is another one of these songs. It clocks in at about 6.5 minutes, and it really should have been 4.5 to 5 minutes long. I also don't like the effect they use on the guitar solo. But that one's frustrating, kind of like with Bleeding Me, because there are parts of this song I genuinely like. And I do like Wasting My Hate. I think that song is actually pretty decent, except there's no guitar solo, which there really should have been one. But this album gets frustrating because there are quite a few songs on here that have potential, and there's just always a little something that nags at me with just about every song on here except King Nothing, which I think, like I said before, is the best song on here. It has a pretty catchy guitar riff. And the issue is there are so many songs on here that did not need to exist. We did not need Cure. We did not need Poor Twisted Me. We did not need Outlaw Torn. We did not need the country song. Oh yes, kids, there's a country song on here. And we did not need Ronnie. I think if they had cut those songs off, trimmed a little bit more of the fat with Bleeding Me and House That Jack Built, I think they would actually have an okay album. So I can see a world where this album is actually good. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. That's not what we got. So for me, it's not that the album is a different style that bothers me. It's that this band really didn't execute this style very well. I'm going to give this album a D+. I think it's definitely on the bad side of okay, but it's not something I would consider a full-on bad album, although there are bad tracks on here. Next we have Reload, released in the year of our Lord, 1997. And if 78 minutes wasn't enough of this material, we get 76 more minutes of this material. I will say the bad moments on this album are rarely as bad as the bad moments on Load. And I do think the production is a lot better. The songs sound a lot cleaner on this album compared to Load. But the good moments are rarely as good as the good moments on Load. There are some standout tracks, but overall most of this album is pretty forgettable. This is the first one I had to go back and listen to most of the album again just to remember what any of these songs sound like because it's been so long. And there's a lot of repetition. It does feel like this album is going more for a straight up hard rock sound, which is fine, I don't mind that, but there are still so many songs that are so slow paced on here, and when they do faster songs, they all sound like songs we've already heard before. We get the opener Fuel, which is kind of an up-tempo, kind of dumb, immature song, kind of like Ain't My Bitch, except this one's a little better. I still like this song, I don't care what anyone says. I really like the atmosphere in Unforgiven 2. I don't think we needed a sequel to that song, but I think during the slower parts, it actually has a pretty good atmosphere to it. And overall, I do genuinely like this song. On my re-listen, I remembered Prince Charming. I actually kind of like this track. It's a little more up-tempo. I know it's not a lot of people's favorites, but I kind of dig it. And my favorite song is Where the Wild Things Are. And yes, this song is approaching 7 minutes long, but I think for the most part it makes good use of that time. I never felt like this song really dragged for me. which was not the case with some of the songs on Load. The problem is everything except those 4 songs. At least with Load, most of those tracks I found potential, and I could see a world where that's actually a good album. This album, there's not really any saving it. It doesn't do anything interesting, it just feels like a retread of stuff we've already heard for the most part. Even in Where the Wild Things Are and Unforgiven 2, which have some decent atmosphere, I feel like we already got that in Bleeding Me. Granted, I think these 2 songs are better than Bleeding Me, but we still already got this. So there's just nothing really here to really get into outside of those 4 songs for me. The Memory Remains is pretty frustrating because this should be a good song. I actually really like a lot of the aspects of it. The problem is we get 2 prolonged sections of some old woman croning, and I'm not interested in listening to that. And when you think of all the fantastic female singers that existed, even in the 90s, you mean to tell me if they wanted to bring a female on to do some vocals, they couldn't find somebody with a good voice? I know they existed because 2 years later, Seven Dust released their second album and they had some lady on one of those songs and she has a killer voice. So you cannot tell me they could not have found somebody with a good voice to do that and actually give her lyrics, not this na-na-na bullshit. So that's the one song with potential that they just ruined. Everything else is forgettable. Even the faster moments feel like retreads. One of the songs sounds like a bad version of King Nothing. I think it was Slither, but I can't remember now. For some reason, people seem to like the song Fixer, and I can't figure out why. That song drags and goes nowhere. This album is a perfect example of a D-rated album for me. It's definitely on the bad side of okay, but not bad enough to be a bad album. Next, we have Saint Anger, released in 2003, and things got worse. Much worse. Full disclosure, I have never heard this album in its entirety, and my God, I never will. Now, for the purposes of this review, I did go listen to a solid 2 to 3 minutes per track, but that's about all I could handle. I probably put a good 30 minutes into listening to this album, and that was enough. This album clocks in at 75 minutes, so we are slowly getting these albums a little shorter, but they are still way too long. This is one of those instances where I do feel like it's important to mention things that went on with the band. So Jason Newsted left the band at this point, so they got their producer from the 90s albums, Bob Brock, to play bass. So he was officially a member of the band, which is interesting. And apparently there was a lot of turmoil within the band. Infighting, the band had to go to therapy. James was dealing with alcohol addiction. I'm sure there were other substance abuse issues going on at the time. And the band was nearly done. And especially given the next album, I'm glad they were able to work through things. And apparently recording this album was part of them working through those things. That being said, the album is not good. And what can I say about this album that hasn't already been said? The production on this album is absolutely terrible. It has the sound of that low quality MP3 style that you would have downloaded from Kazaa or LimeWire back in the 2000s, if anybody's old enough to remember those platforms. I'm guessing maybe they were going for a raw garage band sort of vibe, and it just doesn't work, especially from a band of this caliber. Frankly, I don't want a garage band sound from any band I listen to be honest. It's not my thing, it's not what I'm into. They took out the guitar solos, I guess because bands weren't doing them at this time. Although oddly enough, this album does get heavier than the previous albums, so that's something. And of course, that snare drum. That sounds like somebody banging on pots and pans or a trash can. Now, I can't appreciate the idea of, hey, drums sound the same in every album, let's try something different. But it really did not work. And Lars bangs on that snare drum a lot on this album. It's pretty bad. And hence why I could not listen to this album in its entirety. Actually, part of that would be the song lengths, because a bunch of these songs are 7 or 8 minutes long, and at least a couple of them, I would get 2-3 minutes in and I'd feel like, okay, this song should be ending. Saint Anger being one of them. And then I'd look and the song's like 7.5 minutes long. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I don't know what they're going to be doing after this point. I know there are no guitar solos. All I know is I'm not going to be interested, so I would nope out of that song. Why these songs were not 3 to 4 minutes long, I have no idea. There was no reason for any of these songs to be more than that. Maybe 4.5 minutes if I'm being generous, if they really had an idea. And the lyrics are absolutely cringe-worthy. Now, sometimes this can work to a comedic effect. The song Frantic, I actually don't mind. It actually has some decent moments. I actually kind of like the verses in this track. Yeah, the frantic tick-tock part and the lifestyle bit are cringy as hell, but they're kind of funny at the same time, so I can kind of get on board with this song, actually. If the production was better, if you had a better guitar and drum sound, if there was a guitar solo, maybe remove the frantic tick part, or keep it, whatever. Like I said, it's kind of funny. I think they could have had something with this song, actually. But as it stands, it's still on this album, so it's just one of the better songs. And the Unnamed Feeling is actually a pretty decent song, but again, ruined by being a bit overly long and no guitar solo, and again, bad production. Other than that, there's not really anything I enjoy on this album. I will admit that there are some decent guitar riffs here and there. And the thing is, I get that these guys were going through some struggles. That's fine. I get that maybe they needed to record this in order for the band to continue. Again, that's fine. And I'm not even going to say that there wasn't potential in what they were doing here. But they did not have to release this. They could have taken these ideas, come back when they were a little more focused, and really developed these songs into something better. Writing songs based off pure emotion can absolutely work. And if you've got a songwriter and a lyricist who can really communicate through their lyrics what they're feeling, and they have the talent to really put the music to it that the song needs, you can absolutely have that work. There are moments where this can work with bands. It's just, unfortunately, kind of like I said before, these guys are good at what they do, but if they try to expand on that and do something different, it doesn't work, unfortunately. And that's really the case with this album. And it's a shame because while I don't think it has the potential Load did, I think there were some solid guitar riffs. And if this is something really personal to these guys, that's fine. Take these ideas and get an outside songwriter to help flesh them out a bit. But that's not what they did. This album obviously gets an F. It is hands down their worst album and one of the worst albums by a band I like that has ever been put out. Next, we have 2008's Death Magnetic, and finally things get back on track. This is hands down the best album they've put out since the Black Album. I like it better than the Black Album, or the self-titled album, whatever you want to call it. And we finally see the band going back a little bit more to their 80s style. They're actually doing a metal album again. And they've kind of gone away from oversimplifying their music like they did in Load and Reload. And they're putting actual songs together, unlike Saint Anger. So that's a plus. The worst thing I can say about this album is the production sucks. At times, this thing sounds like it's blasting through an old radio with really crappy speakers, and the sound gets distorted. Now, I heard that they did a remaster digitally that came out in 2015. I've also heard there's a Rock Band or Guitar Hero version that's supposed to sound pretty good. I haven't heard those. I did find a fan remastered version of it that actually sounded pretty good, so that's what I've got on my iPod. That's right, kids, I still use an iPod because I like owning my music. So when I want to hear this album, that's what I go with, but yeah, the production is still really bad on this one. Thankfully, this is the last album with production issues so far. Now, after this review, who knows if they're going to release something else with bad production. I hope not. The good news is these songs are pretty good here. The bad news is the album is still 75 minutes long because these songs are still longer than they should be. Now, I'm not averse to long songs. Master of Puppets is a classic. That song's about 9 minutes long, if I remember correctly, and it stays engaging the whole time. Now, I don't think the length really drags out these songs that much, but most of the tracks on here are 7 or 8 minutes long, which does feel like it's getting a bit too much, considering there's still nothing overly complicated going on here to really warrant that length. There's only one song that's 5 minutes long, nothing under that. Everything else is 6 minutes or longer, and like I said, most of these songs are 7 or 8 minutes long. Thankfully, this only usually results in me getting mildly bored in the middle of some of these songs, but overall they are good. The album opens with 2 of my favorite songs by the band. That Was Just Your Life, which starts off with a slow intro building towards a heavy thrasher. I remember hearing this song and being really surprised that we were actually getting Metallica back again. It's not the 80s, but it definitely feels like something that would be released by the band that put out that material. There's some really nice guitar riffs going on here. I like the frantic nature of the chorus. And it's the best Metallica opener that we've had in a while. Probably since Blackened. The end of the line feels like if Load were a metal album, that might be what this would be, because there's a couple guitar riffs that remind me of those albums, but they're mixed in really nicely with an up-tempo metal song. And I really like the chorus on this one. The guitar riffs are solid. It's just another really good track. The album kind of meanders a little bit with Broken, Beaten, Scarred. It's not a bad track. It's all right. It's not one I would skip, but it's not a highlight for me. The Day That Never Comes kind of embodies what I was saying about the lengths of these songs. The mellow parts of this track are actually pretty good. The verses and chorus both work nicely, but the song kind of meanders after the second chorus and never really comes back around. It gets heavier and faster, which is fine. You can do that in a ballad. They've proven that before with Welcome Home Sanitarium or One, so they can do it and have it work. It's probably a little bit more of an extreme case with this song compared to most of those songs I mentioned, but that can still work. It's just the song feels like it meanders after that point. And it's not that what they have there is bad, it's just it feels like the song loses focus. And it does drag out a bit. And then we get All Nightmare Long, which is another one of my favorite songs on this album. This one, again, has a really nice chorus. There's some really good guitar riffs. And yes, I do realize that I say a lot of the same things about songs I like. It's just a really good song. So the first half of this album is really solid. The second half does dip in quality, but it's still not too bad. We've got the Unforgiven 3, as if we needed a third Unforgiven. And unlike the second one, this one actually changes things up. It's not a retread of the first one. So that's nice. It is actually a pretty decent song, and well, yeah, it's probably a little longer than it should be. It doesn't feel unfocused, which is nice. The Judas Kiss is also a really good heavier track. It has one of my favorite choruses. It did not need to be 8 minutes long though. This thing should have been 4.5 to 5 minutes tops, but it is still a really good song. Cyanide I know was a single, but for some reason this song never did anything for me at all. And I mentioned instrumentals typically don't do it for me. If it's not Call of Cthulhu, I'm not listening to it. And then My Apocalypse ends the album on a heavy thrasher. That song is pretty decent, but it kind of goes into the territory of Broken, Beaten, Scarred. It's decent, I'll listen to it. Like I said, there's nothing bad on this album. There's nothing that you need to skip. It is actually a really solid album. It's just a shame about the production. And if they ever do a remaster of this thing, proper, that actually fix these production issues, I would definitely pick it up. I'm going to give this album a solid B. It is still really good. It's got its issues, but overall, it's still a good album. Next, we have Hardwired to Self-Destruct, released in 2016. I went into this one expecting to give this album a C. And unfortunately, this thing disappointed me. Now, I do remember not really digging it all that much upon its release, but man, did this album really not do it for me this time. The album is back to a 77-minute runtime, split up into 2 discs. I'm assuming they split the songs up in order to give listeners a break, which I guess I can respect that, except why make people have 2 discs when all of these songs would fit on one? Now, I still feel like this album is way too long, as you're probably not surprised by now given how I've complained about the lengths of several albums. The production is pretty solid, finally, and this album borrows a lot from Death Magnetic, Load and Reload. It's kind of like if Load and Reload had been metal albums. That's kind of what this is. And given how I feel about the end of the line from the previous album, I'm on board with that in terms of style. Unfortunately, this album just feels like repetition. Now, the album Disc 1 starts off pretty solid. Disc 1 is easily the better of the 2, with Hardwired, Moth into Flame, Now That We're Dead, and Atlas Rise. All 4 of these songs are decent, particularly the last 3. Hardwired I'm not really that big into, but it is okay. Mainly the chorus, particularly the lyrics, are pretty cringy. But it's still not bad, and I feel like in Now That We're Dead and Moth into a Flame, we actually get some better guitar solos than I've heard from this band in a while. So that's always nice. Now That We're Dead has a bit of a unique feel to it, which I appreciate. But after that, we get a slew of tracks, ending out Disc 1 and then starting Disc 2 that do absolutely nothing for me. Except to remind me of Death Magnetic, because I've heard riffs from The Day That Never Comes, Cyanide, and Broken, Beaten, Scarred in this album. Or at least riffs that remind me of those songs. And it just makes me want to hear Death Magnetic. I was surprised by Here Comes Revenge. That song is actually okay. I don't think it's as good as the first 4 songs I mentioned, but I was surprised when I actually could see myself listening to the song again. And the verses actually do sound a little unique, so I appreciate that. But then we get more songs that do nothing for me, and then we get the closer, Spit Out the Bone, which this song is pretty solid. It's a heavy thrasher, and I can see why a lot of people consider this the best song on the album. It is pretty solid and really the only track I care to listen to on Disc 2. Yeah, I said Here Comes Revenge is okay, but that doesn't mean I want to go out of my way to listen to it. The production is solid, the sound of this album is pretty good, but there's too much repetition, too much stuff I've already heard, and none of these songs really do anything for me. I also think this is the album where Kirk lost his device, either his phone or whatever it was that he had his riffs on, so he wasn't able to contribute to the album, apparently. I don't know. I expected to give this album a C, but honestly, I'd rather listen to Load than this. Technically, it's probably better. It's certainly more in the style that I prefer, but I'm going to give this album a D. I just don't really care for it. It's not a bad album, but we are on the bad side of okay. And finally, we have 72 Seasons released in 2023. And this album doesn't do much for me. Again, it feels like a retread of the Death Magnetic stuff, only not as good, with better production. The opening track, which is the title track, is pretty good. Lex Eternal is pretty good. It has a vibe that reminds me a lot of their Motorhead covers they did in the 90s. And If Darkness Had a Sun is decent. Other than that, none of these songs really do much for me. Every now and again, there will be an interesting moment, but overall, they just don't really do anything for me. And I listened to this album for this review and I fell asleep during it, if that tells you anything. The next best song after the 3 I mentioned would probably be the last track, but this thing is over 11 minutes long and it did not need to be that long, which is something I've said a lot during this review. But at least that song has a distinct chorus, unlike most of the songs on this album. And I've heard some people say with this album that they're confused because people were mad about them changing their sound with Load and Reload and Saint Anger. But the thing is, from Kill 'Em All through Death Magnetic, every album sounded different except Load and Reload, which were basically a double album. But they've gotten to the point where they just repeat themselves, and it gets really tiring listening to it, because it feels like each album is a more inferior version of Death Magnetic. Again, I'm going to give this album a D. I don't think it's that good. It's not terrible. It's okay. And a good reason why I have the distinction between good side of okay and bad side of okay. If somebody happened to play this album in the car or something, I wouldn't be mad, but this is not an album I plan on going back to ever, except for those 3 songs I mentioned before. And that's it. My Metallica discography review, down. It is interesting going back and looking at these albums and seeing just how many of these albums I actually don't care for is kind of funny. But they will always be a legendary band because of the first 5 albums. But as I said, that's it for this review. This lasted a lot longer than I wanted it to, but oh well. I'm thinking Avenged Sevenfold will be my next discography review, followed by Skid Row, then Megadeth, then Guns N' Roses. I am open to suggestions. If you've made it this far through the review, then I think you've earned the right to request a band you want me to talk about. So thank you very much for watching. Until the next discography review, or if you want to check out my Let's Plays of older video games, you're welcome to do that too. I'll see you in the next one.